Welcome to the community.
My name is Schapira, and I'm a writer and a teacher here in Providence, Rhode Island.
Do you want to tell me a little bit about how you got started doing the work that you do, both as an artist, as a writer, but also how that gave way to a community work?
Sure. So when I moved to Providence, I didn't know anyone except my partner who I moved with. And I was already thinking about ways to share creative work that you could just do without involving any kind of official role. Or, you know, I was a poet at that time, and I had sent stuff in for publication. But I was also interested in, like, what if you didn't do it like that? So I started writing a serial story and pasting it up on, like, lampposts and telephone poles around the city. And I was mentoring a teenager at the time, and I paid her to translate it into Spanish, so then we had it in English and Spanish. And I did that for, like, I don't know, a couple of years. So I feel like from the beginning of living here, I've been thinking about the connection between, like, what you make, how to share it, what people get out of it, and making contact with creative work and imagination easy to have. The next sort of, if we're thinking about this as like an arc, the next thing that happened maybe was that I started doing poetry on demand at events. So I would have a typewriter, people come up to me and ask for a poem about what were some good ones. A really beautiful one was somebody who was changing their gender came up to me at an event and asked for a poem about changing their name. And I wrote a poem for them about changing their name. A really funny one was somebody came up to me at a different event and asked for a poem about faking their own death. So it was just whatever anybody wanted. This was like, it was a little bit of a like a one-way flow. It was a little bit of a transaction. It was a little bit of a collaboration, but maybe not as much of a collaboration as, you know, later I would sort of like to try to have or see.
Right. And what was the reaction of people, both in the instances where you posted poems around the city and also when you were collaborating or working with folks on the spot?
Well, I didn't really get to see people react to the posted ones. They were just kind of there. The only concrete reaction that I ever saw was that someone ripped it down and threw it on the ground and peed on it. So that
wow.
was criticism, I guess, and that's fine too. You know,
yeah.
You put something out there, that can happen.
Because you're using the public space too.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the park is for everybody. But I mentioned that practice because I think it's like the prototype of the thing that I have done the most in Providence, which is this climate anxiety counseling project, where I have a little booth made of garbage, essentially, and I set it up in public places, and it has a little sign on it that says climate anxiety counseling, 5 cents, like the Charlie Brown booth, the booth that Lucy has. And people can stop and talk to me if they want.
I'm curious about what effect that has on you.
I mean, it's complicated, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because on the one hand, like, I love it, obviously. Like, I wouldn't do it if I didn't love it. And that, I sometimes feel a little odd about that. It's like, what is going on that I'm, like, enthused about absorbing people's hard stories? On the other hand, it requires a level of kind of being attentive and present that I think is very similar to how I am in the classroom, actually. And just really, like, paying attention to and hearing and noticing what is going on as the conversation unfolds. And both of those things, are tiring in the same way that doing something that takes a lot of effort is tiring. I don't think that it makes me feel worse. I started the project because I just did not feel competent talking with people about climate change and how I was feeling about it and how it was freaking me out. And I just wanted to get better at talking about it, and also to see if in the city where I lived, the people who I passed by every day could also create a way of talking about it together. That's kind of where I was going with it and how it started. I am in the same space as people, knowing what it is, or a piece, I guess, of what it is that's really going on with them. And I think I would rather know than not know most of the time.
Right. And what are some of the things that stick out? Like some of the conversations that were brought to you?
One person who I think about a lot is a guy from the first season, a young guy, Latino guy, who talked with me about his 3-year-old. His son was 3, and he was like, I have a 3-year-old son, and I'm not worried about my future, but I'm worried about his future. How do people not care to not make it worse? That was the way that he described it. And that really stuck with me, that feeling of frustration that kind of the world was not caring for his son the way that he did. And not like preparing a way for his son in the way that he was trying to do. Everybody's life keeps unfolding after they talk to me, right? So like in the setup that we have, where there's many more forces that are trying to destroy people than are trying to keep them alive, I don't always get to know what happened after the moment where, you know, this person's life bumped into my life.
So that is part of your writing process then too, like the reflection.
Yeah. The stuff that I would write from it would be the writing part of it. You know, like I would take notes while it was happening, but then I would write down things that I noticed, or things that I heard, or things that I felt, things that what people had said made me think of. For a couple of seasons, I also did what I was calling alternate histories, which were kind of like almost science fiction stories, starting from the premise of a world where whatever was worrying a particular person who was speaking to me, imagining a world where that worry was absent, and what else would that world have to look like.
So it's literally putting your imagination at the service of these stories.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
But again, part of the problem with it, or I don't know if it was a problem, but part of the constraint, I guess, of it was that, like, because it was a fleeting contact, I don't know that any of the people whose stories I built upon ever got to see those imaginings.
While we're talking about this, it seems very clear too that your interest in mental health is present in these projects, but can you tell me a little bit about how do you envision that, and you know, what your hope as well?
Sure. So I didn't have any particular interest in mental health as like a community health activity when I started this project. But one of the things that I noticed is, as I said, people saw the sign that said anxiety, and they were so in need of someone to talk to that they were willing to talk to a random white lady on the street who, when they said, "Are you a doctor?" I would say no, because I'm not, and they would tell their story in any case most of the time. Sometimes people would be like, "Okay, never mind," and I'd be like, "Okay, fair." But if that's how it is for you, then something is going on. If you're willing to talk to a stranger about what's going on with you, something is going on. It started to become clear that in addition to the material barriers to working together to make life better in the city and in the world, there were also these barriers of state of mind, and of like the marks that suffering has left on people, and what that does to our ability to communicate with one another and to work together.
I'm very intrigued about that. I also want to capitalize on this sign that you had, because your sign said anxiety counseling.
Yeah, it said climate anxiety counseling.
So you were naming something.
Yes.
that was very specific.
Yes.
And people were responding to that.
Yes. So I think when people who had been paying attention to it had been reacting to it with an increasing sense that there was a mismatch between what they knew was happening and the public perception of it, which also included like the government perception of it. They were glad to be talking to someone who also shared that perception
Right, right.
of this as something that could destroy our lives.
What was your awakening to this situation being as critical as it is?
It's because of an article that I read in 2013 about coral reefs and the fact that there's pretty likely to, or how it was looking then and kind of how it's looking even more now, pretty likely to not be anymore. That just hadn't occurred to me. That not just a species, but a whole ecological situation could disappear. I'm at work, I'm crying at my desk, come home, crying on the couch. And that whole winter, I kind of grieved and fretted. And then I started sort of chewing on this idea of, okay, well, if I'm having trouble talking about this, because I would bring it up to people, right? And their reactions would not be the same. They wouldn't even be close.
How did people react?
They would, they would say like that it was sad. They would say, or one person was like, well, it really does you credit that you care about this so much. And I'm like, you're an alien. Like, I remember that being my internal reaction, which I did not say out loud.
Right, because he wasn't expressing concern about it for himself.
Right, exactly. And, I remember like my oldest and dearest friend was like, I feel like this is kind of an extreme reaction. And recently we were talking about it, and she was like, I remember that conversation. And I'm like, yeah, man, I wish you had been right. She's like, yeah, I wish I had been right too. And this is maybe back to kind of, what is the art part of this? Like, what is the creativity part of this? Because I think that like, what I had trained my brain to do and what I had kind of been rewarded by the people around me for doing over the years is finding a way to make something out of things, to turn things into other things, to make something. And so those, even though I was in this pretty deep distress, and even though I felt alone in it, the part of my brain that's like, well, what do you do when something happens? You make something, started to kick in. And that's kind of how I got to making the climate anxiety counseling booth. Kind of also going back to the idea of mental health and like pure mental health care, I think sometimes a danger, and I really fell into this too in my first, especially in my first years at the booth, is to get the making part or the solution-y part kicking in before you know what it is that's really going on with someone. So you got to hear the whole story. You got to ask a lot of questions. You got to really know how somebody who's talking to you sees the thing that they're experiencing and is happening to them. And then you also have to ask, like, what have you tried? Have you tried this? Have you tried that? Because you don't want to be suggesting things that they've already tried that they know don't work for them.
Right.
And then you can maybe say, do you want a suggestion?
Has that somehow affected your work in the classroom or
Oh yeah.
influenced it?
Yeah, it all flows. I ask way more questions now, and I make way more space for my students now. It's definitely made me a better teacher.
I want to connect that to today. What things are you paying attention to right now?
A little before that time, I had also started talking with people, seeking out specific interviews, also building on some of the conversations that I'd had with people at the booth. I think all of those things are things that the idea of practice can help us do in a way that's kind of like medium stakes, that can have those responses more available to us when the stakes are higher.
Right, right, absolutely.
And the stakes being high could be like, there's a disaster and people have to get together to respond to it. Or there's a disaster and it subsides and then people are still hurting and people have to figure out how they're going to respond to each other. I don't know, one of the questions that you had sort of asked in our kind of preliminary conversation was, what is community, right? Like, what is that? Your community is the people who you have to work shit out with. Where, like, in a certain way, you're stuck with each other. You're required to deal with each other in order to keep living. And it's nice if you like each other. It's nice if you want to be on good terms or to get back to being on good terms. But it's more like, if something comes up, your community is the people who, like, if something comes up, it's going to affect all of you and you all have to deal with it.
And what you're saying makes me think so much about this idea that we may not always be on the same page and agree with everyone inside of that circle, inside of that community, but how to create space for disagreement.
Exactly. And in fact, disagreement is how change takes place. It's not the only way, but it's one of the ways. In order to respond to the forces that are really lining up to destroy most people and most living beings, how do people who do not want to be destroyed align themselves with one another in a way that's lasting and also in a way that feels good in the moment or good enough in the moment?
You've been in Providence for 20 years.
I have.
And you have done a lot of work as an artist, also with other people. So I'm curious how your perception of the city might have changed.
I think that, of course, the city has changed, right? I think that the city's public priorities are very uneven in terms of who its choices serve. If we're thinking about, like, what does the city as a municipality, as a governing body, as a funding body, who do those choices serve? And I think that often its choices serve either people who aren't here yet, whose money they're hoping to attract, or people who are already here but whose money they want to not threaten. And that means that things that would make the city more livable if they were distributed better are not distributed as well as they could be. So I'm talking about housing, I'm talking about various public health measures, I'm talking about harm reduction, the things that people materially need. People who have been served by or served enough by things staying the way that they are, certainly, but also even people who have not been, who have sort of been hurt by life working the way that it does, by jobs working the way that they do, by, like, schools working the way that they do, work in a really hard and sometimes kind of panicky way to try to keep things the same. So if you do depend on, for example, municipal funding to do the art that you want to do, you might panic at the thought of having to give that up or of challenging anything about the way that that's set up or the way that the city shares that money or that the state shares that money. If you have been hoping that you could send your kid to college, right? The idea that, like, maybe college shouldn't be a thing, and I say that as a college professor, is maybe gonna, like, make you feel a little bit like you're being stabbed. In order for humans and other living beings to share a livable future, is there anything that humans have to let go of in the present? And what are those things? And how do we bring ourselves to that place? What is the version of the world and the city that's livable and sustaining, not just for you, but for more people? And are there things that you are willing to trade for that about the way that your life is now or the way that the city is now?
Mm-hmm.
Are there things that you could see, oh yeah, the fact that I'm clinging to this, staying the way that it is actually standing in my way and is standing in our way?
Yeah. Yeah. How we adapt to change, right?
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, this is a climate change question too, right? Do you make the change before the disaster, or do you wait until the way of living that you have is kind of ripped out of your hands by the flood?
In other words, willingly or by need.
Willingly or by need?
Yeah.
Because it feels different to offer something and to have it stolen from you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Kate, I feel like a lot of the things that we talked today are gonna come back to me, and as we edit this, I'm gonna have more questions.
Okay.
And to continue this, but for today, I want to thank you so much for your time. And
Thanks so much for asking such great questions and for making this space, and thanks for recording us and being here.